First, how do you fight or even explain the invisible machine?
Imagine the future. A strange new weapon detonated high over a large city. No explosion, no visible destruction, but everything electronic within the range of this weapon dies permanently. Every electronic gadget in every home and office disabled. No computers, no TV, no life support systems in hospitals, no water supply, no heat, no lights. Truly a return to the Dark Ages.
Everything that we've built up in the last 200 years, let alone in the last 20 years, would be completely destroyed, would be non-existent. Imagine the cost that it would be to rebuild our cities. Think of it in terms of transportation. We might even have to pump water. It's at that basic level.
Imagine a full range of new weapons. One can take out the electricity in your city. The other can destroy you.
We have been testing what I'm going to call microwave weapons for crowd control. You can affect a large area by sweeping the beam and making sure that people are in the beam long enough to get a very nasty sensation of being cooked, which, to a very fine depth, they are.
If you haven't heard about these weapons, it's no surprise. Their development has been secretive, and they sound more like science fiction than reality.
We're just learning enough about the science to be dangerous. It's like giving a kindergartner a hand grenade and hoping they don't pull the pin.
Welcome to the world of electromagnetic warfare. Bell Island, Newfoundland, on the edge of the Atlantic. A uniquely quiet place until one Sunday morning in April 1978. As people made their way to church, a colossal bolt of energy shot straight out of the sky, blasting the peaceful island. Barbara McKim witnessed the bolt from her house in Conception Bay, 20 kilometers from Bell Island.
We heard this terrific, loud bang, boom noise. The house shook. The dishes rattled in the cupboards. We ran to the living room window and looked out in time to see an oval-shaped object that was moving very, very quickly, and it just seemed to leave a bit of a trail behind. It was quite loud, quite deafening. There was no wobbly movement or anything, no. It was just a trajectory that was heading toward, as we thought at the time, the ocean, but subsequently it did land on the island, yeah.
The bizarre beam was seen by dozens as it exploded onto the property of Jim and Susie Beckford, shattering the solemn Sunday morning. Television sets exploded, fuses shot out of the walls, balls of fire tore through houses.
Yes, I was on Bell Island, April 2nd, 1978.
Steve Parsley, neighbour and son-in-law of the Beckfords, had just left the barn when the bolt struck.
When we looked there through the door and seen, all we could see was dust and ore dust, everything else gone. It was where all the shed blowed up, so it was in the barn blowed up. But it's an awful blast.
Satellites registered light emissions equivalent to those of a 10-megaton blast, making it one of the biggest emissions in history. In Ottawa, Canadian military scanners also picked up the 10-megaton blast. The Prime Minister was alerted, and Fire Inspector Jim Farrell dispatched.
As soon as I saw the fuses and the embedment in the wall, I knew I had something here that was different. I was amazed. The barn was in shambles. Chickens and hens were dead. When I saw the electricity after, or the supercharge after attacking the nails in the floor. When I went outside, I noticed the wires, the insulation just ripping off the wires. I showed Mr. Beckford. He was amazed. He said, "My God, what was it?" And I said, "Boy, I don't know."
While the military investigation continued, the intelligence branch of the RCMP decided to launch their own inquiry.
We had reports from across the Conception Bay here of people that reported seeing objects fall on the island and that. So we checked that out. I ruled it as an electrical, possibly lightning or ball lightning, and that's how we concluded our file.
It wasn't a lightning strike. It was a boom of a ray. It was something like I would see in a James Bond movie.
Lightning, I don't think this blast up here, we came from God knows where, investigating them. So it seems like it was, it was more than lightning.
The official reports concluded that the blast was caused by ball lightning, but the local residents were skeptical and wondered if it had really been caused by a failed military experiment. This was 1978, and given the Cold War climate, speculation and fear were rampant. Russia and the Americans were protecting and developing their nuclear arsenals. Reason enough for fear. But what wasn't known about was the developing and testing of a very new and secret wave of weapons. By the time the blast occurred on Bell Island, these electromagnetic or directed energy weapons had been in the works for 30 years. This research has continued and will usher in a whole new way of war.
The revolution in military affairs, the RMA as the military calls it, which is a total shift away from bombs, bullets, and ordnance into energy weapons as the primary driver, whether it be high-powered lasers, ion beams, microwave radiation for creating heat sensations on the body. This is where the direction is going. And the military, in a paper called The Revolution in Military Affairs and Conflict Short of War, written in 1989 by the U.S. Army War College, talked about this shift, and they equated it to the discovery of, or the introduction rather, of gunpowder in the Middle Ages in Europe and the introduction of atomic weapons in the last century. The change that's taking place now is just as profound as the changes that took place then.
It has been said that the history of mankind is the history of war. If that is true, then the history of man is about to take a frightening leap into the future.
Since the beginning of the age of modern science, you've obviously seen a rapid development in rapid improvement in the technology of weapons. It's perfectly obvious. You starting with gunpowder, really. The cannon-bearing ship, the rise of air forces, improvements in explosives, and so on and so forth.
When the First World War broke out, all of this military technology and force was unleashed on the world. A generation enjoying the peace and progress of liberal society was amazed and shocked. That war pitched the world into a century of violence.
This ascending curve of technical capacity to unleash violence, of course, reached its absolute apogee with the appearance of the nuclear weapon. This really brought to a culmination a tendency that had begun, way back in the Stone Age, when the first human being picked up a bone and started beating his rival. It really began there and continued all the way to the nuclear weapon.
The prospect of mutually assured destruction might have kept the superpowers in check, but it did nothing to slow weapons development. As the 21st century unfolds, the same technology that gave us the benefit of cell phones, microwaves, and remote control is now being applied to a completely new array of powerful weapons. A development veiled in secrecy, until a certain New York Times reporter started digging.
Well, the New York Times wanted to do a story on the new frontiers of military technology, and we have done a lot of work previously on what have been called smart bombs and the satellite-guided munitions. We really wanted to find really what the next frontier was, and I did some reporting, talking to some military analysts that I know, and also some people actually in the investment community who follow companies that make their money off government contracts, and they mentioned to me this whole new category of weapons known as directed energy or electromagnetic weapons, and that's really how we found out about it. And then we started doing some reporting, and one of the hard things about it was that the government really didn't want to come forward with a lot of information. Most of these programs still remain secret or classified.
Manufacturers are now developing a full range of electromagnetic weapons which pack an invisible wallop, hundreds of times more powerful than the electrical current in a lightning bolt. One can blast enemy missiles out of the sky. Another can be used to blind soldiers on a battlefield. Still another to control an unruly crowd by burning the surface of their skin. If detonated over a large city, an electromagnetic weapon could destroy all electronics in seconds. Though their effects may be different, they have one remarkable feature in common. They all use directed energy to create a powerful electromagnetic pulse.
What is an electromagnetic pulse weapon? Actually, you can think of it, probably too simply, but not terribly inaccurately, as a lightning bolt on steroids. Right now, an electromagnetic pulse from a lightning bolt is a pretty crude club. The wavelength is way too long. So ideally, what you would like to do is shift the energy of the electromagnetic pulse from the long wavelength of a lightning bolt down into a microwave. Now, what is a microwave? Microwaves are all the waves between a meter and a millimeter. Now think of how well that couples with everything in our society, because almost everything we use electronically fits between a meter and a millimeter. If you look at a standard electromagnetic device that's made to read electromagnetic pulses like your cell phone, here's an antenna. It's actually made to absorb electromagnetic radiation. It's just not designed to take the power of the pulse of an electromagnetic weapon.
These electromagnetic weapons can be used to destroy basically anything with a chip in it. Not only communication systems and devices, but power systems, television and radio systems. Even most cars these days have an electronic ignition in them. And if they were deployed in the relevant place, in our society now, and in many countries, anything with a chip in it could be disabled.
The electromagnetic pulse effect as a weapon really came to our attention quite accidentally during the early atomic tests. When the first detonations occurred, unprotected electromagnetic equipment, which we had a lot of back then, died. And of course, this came to everybody's attention because a lot of this was instrumentation that was supposed to be recording the effects of the weapon. So, of course, everybody standing around this early destroyed and arced out and melted equipment, shaking their heads and saying, what happened? Especially since there was no wind damage, there was no overpressure damage, there was just fried electrical equipment. Well, it didn't take long after a few tests and iterations to realize there's a huge electromagnetic pulse generated when a nuclear weapon explodes. And a huge electromagnetic pulse is very destructive to unprotected electrical equipment. And then it was sort of like, whoa, there's a weapon effect here. So early in the 50s, at Los Alamos, where they were doing this high-level nuclear work, they said, what about just creating this electromagnetic pulse? And that's where the early work was done on trying to figure out a way to convert explosive energy into electrical energy. And since that time, we've had laboratories and an active research program that's been spending its time develop electromagnetic and high-energy microwave weapons.
The Los Alamos lab in New Mexico, the birthplace of the atomic bomb, and an area controlled by the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense. Signs warn visitors that roads may be closed at any time without warning. It's hard to believe that this forbidding place could have any connection to tranquil Bell Island in Newfoundland. But in 1978, they were linked, when defense satellites picked up a light emission far more powerful than that of the Hiroshima bomb. This prompted the dispatch of 2 scientists from Los Alamos to Bell Island. Within 24 hours, 2 investigators, John Warren and Robert Freeman, appeared on the remote island. The arrival of 2 visitors from an American weapons lab surprised the residents of Bell Island. But the situation became even more bizarre with the arrival of a Russian general flanked by US and Canadian military personnel. Why would the Russians cross continents in order to conduct an investigation at the Beckford home?
Military personnel from Canada, from the United States, as well as from Russia, were here over the next period of time down into the area. They came to the office and wondered if we had anything different than what they had obtained themselves, which we didn't. We shared stories. However, that's all. They didn't share any of their findings with us.
I gave them exhibits that I had seized. They placed the exhibits in a metal box which was properly locked and secured. They were very secretive. If they wanted to discuss anything, they said, "Excuse us for a moment," and they went a distance and they wrote down notes. And they'd come back and they'd interview me again.
Why did Cold War enemies rush to Bell Island to investigate a lightning strike? Maybe it wasn't a lightning strike at all, but as some newspapers and scientists speculated, the result of some military experiment gone terribly wrong.
The precision of our electromagnetic pulse, much like the precision of our regular munitions, our conventional munitions, has increased significantly. So we'll be able to take out the electricity in a city block or in a command and control center, something like that. If we were looking at what a electromagnetic pulse might look like, if you could see it, it would be sort of like when you see in the cartoons when there's a pulsating cone of energy that comes out of something, that comes down from the line of sight. That would kind of be like what an electromagnetic pulse would visualize like, if you could visualize it.
Electromagnetic waves come, of course, in all sort of forms. People may not realize that the light that that makes me visible in this moment, all right, is an electromagnetic wave. It's a particular part of the what we call the spectrum of electromagnetic waves that our eyes are sensitive to. Electromagnetic waves are also heat, for example. When we say that the sun warms us up, it's a particular form of electromagnetic waves that we don't see, but that our skin sees, and sees it as warmth. We are in a soup of electromagnetic radiation. Almost anywhere you are, you can pick up your cell phone and receive a phone call. You can turn your TV and some signal will come through.
These electromagnetic waves can be harnessed and used in a variety of ways. In Alaska, there is a facility that does just that. HAARP is a directed energy experiment being undertaken by the US. From HAARP's wide field of antennae, the waves are focused and beamed into the ionosphere high above the Earth's surface. The ionosphere is part of our atmosphere. It contains electrically charged particles and acts like a mirror, reflecting radio waves back to Earth. Sending radio waves into the ionosphere can accelerate its particles, heating specific areas. The particles then reflect the energy back to Earth.
use a system like HARP and you can create really extreme levels of power. HARP, by sending energy up into the ionosphere in the right frequency range, can tap energy that's already there and actually convert it for use within the system.
HARP is so powerful that it can actually cause the ionosphere to pulse in harmony with its signal. The HARP signal can be used as over-the-horizon defensive radar that can detect incoming missiles and aircraft. To do that, HARP uses two different systems. One to create a plasma mirror, and the other to bounce the signal. Once enemy missiles are detected by HARP, the military could use a variety of directed energy weapons to blast enemy targets out of the sky.
HARP is a acronym actually for High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. It started with Dr. Bernard Eastland's really a visionary approach to missile defense, looking for a way to really deal with the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles from either rogue nations or our traditional adversaries.
Basically, the antenna, as originally conceived, was to be big enough and powerful enough to make major modifications to the ionosphere. This was all done at the height of the Cold War, and my focus was on defense against a major Russian missile attack. The plan was to make a shield over Canada, over the United States, over the whole world, which a missile could not penetrate.
While the Americans were developing this technology, the Russians were conducting similar experiments. Some speculated that the Belle Island blast was the result of Soviet testing of directed energy weapons. The theory was that Belle Island had acted like a giant magnet. The place contains vast underground iron ore deposits and abandoned mines laced with miles of copper piping. The belief is that an electromagnetic signal passed over the island in 1978 and was drawn down by its magnetic field.
The Belle Island event is a unique event, and I have not heard of repeat events, so it's very hard to really pin down what happened there. But the types of things that might have occurred involved high voltages, involved electrically conducting paths through the atmosphere, and a fully developed antenna, as I was describing, would probably allow you to induce voltages in pipelines, to do things that could create high voltages.
In terms of Belle Island, you know, I can't speak specifically to the events that may have occurred there and did occur there in terms of connecting it clearly to a transmitter like HARP. But let's talk about some of the things that you could expect to see from these kinds of technologies being deployed. One of the big issues is what happens if the signal coming off the ground that gets focused up into the ionosphere acts as a conductive shunt. In other words, like a copper wire being plugged in to a power source. This energy then would act as sort of a conduit to draw energy off of the ionosphere. Now, what would that do? You would create the biggest bolt of lightning you've ever seen in your life, striking the Earth 40 times a second until all that energy was discharged.
Although little was known about electromagnetic weapons until recently, the science is not new.
This research started quite some time ago, in fact even before the Second World War. And the reason I think that it has only sort of come, if you can put it that way, to fruition now, is first of all that the electronic world has become so dominant. The web, the internet, and this sort of a pervasive global electronic networks, which now become so substantial that they become military targets. So if you can cripple whatever makes this global network vibrant and active and useful, you have a powerful advantage.
The battlefield may already have changed. There was speculation that the weapons were used in combat in Kosovo in 1999. Then, during the war in Iraq in 2003, it was reported that a top-secret version of the Tomahawk cruise missile was fired. Shortly after the launch, the lights went out in Baghdad, though no physical damage was seen at the power plant. What we do know is that if a high-powered microwave E-bomb were deployed, it would have to be launched with a Tomahawk cruise missile.
I believe, and my military sources indicate to me, that these devices have been used perhaps for the first time in Iraq, yes. But there's been no public confirmation of that.
Are the days of shock and awe drawing to a close, to be replaced by invisible weapons and invisible machines? E-bombs, lasers, masers and microwaves will use directed energy to blow missiles from the sky, neutralize the enemy without bloodshed, and attack communication systems, throwing command and control centers into chaos. Unlike conventional bombs, the E-bomb will turn over and go point down on the target. A massive current pulse runs down the bomb, driving the energy forward and dumping it into the microwave antennae. The bomb destroys itself, disintegrating high in the air just as the microwave beam blasts out onto the target area. This target area is called the lethal footprint.
Everything electronic that wasn't hardened there would arc, hiss, and you would smell a lot of burned varnish. We've all burned out an electronic appliance in here, and you know that characteristic, uh-oh, I've cooked it smell. You would smell that a lot because your devices would be arcing over. The goal of the electromagnetic pulse weapon is to make portions of the circuit arc and burn. There's a second category of weapons that basically use laser energy. Whereas the electromagnetic pulse weapon is one big, powerful pulse, a laser is a continuously delivered stream of radiation with enough intensity to cause damage. We will be able to use high-energy lasers not only to defeat enemy aircraft and, even more importantly, unmanned aerial vehicles, which are small targets. We've actually successfully, in several dozen tests, defeated artillery shells with high-energy lasers that are directed at a very small spot with enough energy to detonate the shell in the air before it lands.
These new weapons are not solely for use against artillery and communications. They are also designed for use against people.
Obviously, one thing that's looked at is a blinding laser on the battlefield so that soldiers attacking, for instance, a particular position could be subjected to a broadband sweeping laser with enough energy to temporarily blind the soldier if he were looking in the direction of the laser. And we have been testing what I'm going to call microwave weapons for crowd control. What they do is, again, instead of using a single pulse, these are continuously directed energy weapons that heat the skin very rapidly, much like your microwave oven. In fact, almost exactly like your microwave oven, but they're controlled broadcast microwave pulses. And obviously, you can derail a opposing force very quickly if all the soldiers begin to feel a burning sensation on their skin. That's truly a burning sensation. Now, the nice thing about, from the offensive point of view of a microwave weapon, is you don't really have to critically injure people with a microwave.
In war-torn countries, it is not always easy to separate the opposing forces from ordinary citizens. By using non-lethal directed energy weapons, similar to the benign red laser pointers or supermarket scanners, the military could stop their opponents without causing them permanent injury.
In Somalia, what you saw were Somali militia interspersed with civilians, not wearing uniforms, almost impossible to discriminate from the civilians who surrounded them, who were then using that as an opportunity to fire upon U.S. forces. In a situation like that, the ability to disperse that force using a non-lethal system would be very advantageous and eliminates the the situation of you having to fire upon civilians in an environment where that's the last thing that you really want to do.
Obviously, if your goal is to cause your opponent to desist in whatever he's doing that you don't like, as opposed to killing him, then these are ideal weapons. And as we become more civilized, and as the face of war gets more widely broadcast, the days where I think it would be politically acceptable to create mass carnage on the battlefield like was in World War I, those days are past politically. So, in point of fact, as a reality, we must have weapons that make war, if you will, to the extent it can be, make war in a more civilized manner.
Electromagnetic weapons could be more civilized than conventional weapons, but the long-term effects of the atomic bomb were at first downplayed and poorly understood.
Yes, atomic warfare staggers the imagination, but atomic warfare is still the old story. Get there fastest with the mostest. And because automatic bombing, although in the predictable future, is still not yet here, the best way to get the mostest there the fastest is by the wings of the Air Force.
Every weapon has its unintended and its unexpected consequences. You only have to look at the nuclear weapon to see that. We see the Gulf War syndrome, now believed perhaps to be traceable back to exposure to chemicals during that war, maybe to the abused again in the new war. They're not really sure about it. Nevertheless, it's acknowledged that they have had health effects that the veterans of other wars did not have, and they're being compensated by the government.
The government may know more than the rest of us about the potential health effects of these sorts of systems. We do know that the Air Force has a human systems laboratory where they have been researching what these devices could potentially do to humans. That research has not yet been made public. Theoretically, these weapons are meant to affect electronics without hurting humans, but obviously it will take years and years until we truly know all the health ramifications of how these weapons operate.
These weapons work with directed energy, much like harnessing the power of an overcharged lightning bolt. When the blast occurred at the Beckford home, it was difficult to assess if the mysterious phenomenon had human consequences. Neighbors said Susie Beckford was never the same again. It may be a coincidence, but 4 months after the event, she died. Her death certificate cited heart failure as the cause of death.
Well, it's been suggested that these weapons are more humane because they attack technology, computers, and so forth, rather than human beings, and the VMADs attack the human in a non-lethal way. But that's a very tricky question because there's a distinct possibility, by the way, that others will get these weapons and turn it around and fry our computers and so forth. And believe me, the job of protecting weaponry from the electromagnetic pulse is one that has not been solved and may not really in principle be solvable.
Because of its technological superiority, the U.S. military is certainly the most susceptible to those types of technological innovation. And that's why other countries who realize they can't take the U.S. military on in a fair fight are interested in developing these types of things because they think it's going to help them to even out the playing field.
With every generation and every war, we witness new and improved ways to kill people. The atomic bomb of the Second World War, napalm in Vietnam, smart bombs in Desert Storm. America stands ready to stun the world with a vast array of powerful new weapons, and other countries are lining up for this new electromagnetic arms race.
I don't know who has electromagnetic pulse weapons like the ones that we are developing. The reality is probably countries like China and Russia. Both do have very advanced military technology. China, for example, is at the upper tier of laser technology and things like that. So, I think those are the three countries who will develop this technology. Perhaps India might be able to do it.
Because these electromagnetic weapons are so new, they are not controlled by treaties that cover conventional weapons. The United States has plans to build a missile defense shield over Canada's north to shoot down incoming ballistic missiles. This could lead to the deployment of electromagnetic weapons in space and unleash forces too powerful to control.
I became interested in the Space Preservation Act and in developing the Space Preservation Act when I learned that our administration in Washington was looking at a program called Vision 2020. And Vision 2020 actually is a program for the United States to dominate the world from outer space. Now, I love America, and I'd like to say that we're number one. But let me tell you something. We don't need to be number one in weapons in space. The Department of Defense has been working at a facility in Alaska, which is doing research into effects of electromagnetic frequencies in the ionosphere. And that facility, which is called HAARP, has raised concern among many individuals about how this research would be applied. For example, we know that, according to some of the research, as these energy pulses are directed into the ionosphere, they can have somewhat of an effect.
What kind of negative effects remain to be seen. Electromagnetic pulses could punch holes through the ionosphere and destroy one of the Earth's protective layers in the same way that pollution depletes the ozone layer.
Some people I know have worried about messing with the ionosphere, and I think that needs a lot of investigation, because at the time we were looking at something that could be used to defend us. 6,000 nuclear warheads looking at you kind of trump just about every other thing you might want to look at. But if they ever wanted to build this antenna as big as I was talking about, then you really need to look at side effects.
A weapon can be used for protection, it can be used for deterrence, it also can be used for naked aggression. Just like the scientists that were involved in the Manhattan Project, at the end of the day, we're not responsible for where those devices were used. That decision was made by political authorities. The people involved in the development of these systems are by and large scientists at heart, and the decisions about how these devices will be used will be made by military and political officials.
There are several acts on the books of both the United States and, of course, the United Nations that deal with the preservation of space and not using it for nuclear weapons platforms. But I don't think there's much in the way of verbiage addressing non-nuclear conventional weapons platforms in space. And as our recent decision to abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty I think clearly demonstrates, when we develop a technology that we think we can validly employ to defend the United States, forget the treaties. We are going to defend ourselves. We are going to change the treaties to be consistent with what technology now permits us. That's just going to happen.
Since 9/11, the temperature of the country has changed. I mean, to a very strongly pro-military view of the world. And at the same time, the risks or things that were thought of even a couple of years ago as things we wouldn't take, risks we wouldn't take, now people are more willing to take them and exchanging what they think is safety, security for their own personal liberties and use of new technologies that might have other impacts that are unanticipated.
Directed energy is such a powerful technology, it could be used to heat the ionosphere to turn weather into a weapon of war. Imagine using a flood to destroy a city, or tornadoes to decimate an approaching army in the desert.
the military has spent a huge amount of time on weather modification as a concept for battle environments. Most people don't know, but the United States signed treaties with the former Soviet Union and 60 other countries in the mid-1970s where we agreed not to use geophysical manipulation as weapons of war. Presently, the treaties only allow us to do that within the boundaries of our own country. The reality is you can't contain weather by artificial boundaries.
Should we worry when America says it wants to reopen weather modification treaties? What kind of nightmare would be unleashed if we continue along this path? Although we tend to think of weapons in the context of war, police and the military have often used pepper spray, tear gas and water cannons to control unruly civilians. Microwave weapons, too, could be turned on ordinary citizens, but will they always be used in a non-lethal way?
The theory is that you can do this in such a way that you can cause the discomfort, but without causing any permanent damage. That's a question, and it's a serious question. And the follow-on question to that is, if you can control it is one thing, but what happens if you decide you don't want to control it? What happens if you decide that this is a technology that you want to use as a lethal weapon? That's an issue that's going to have to be dealt with.
You know, the last time burning was used as a way to control behavior was in the Middle Ages, when we used to burn people at the stake. It was decided it was kind of inhumane. Yet we're going back to that exact thing.
If there's one thing we've learned since the initial development of atomic weapons 60 years ago, it's that governments will try to make these devices as powerful as possible, in general. Hopefully never to be used. Hopefully to be a deterrent. But it would not surprise anyone if the government continues to try to make these devices more and more powerful, so that at some point, we don't know, and this is speculation, but at some point it may be possible to develop a device that would disable the communications and electronic systems, anything with a chip in it, the cars, the toasters, the refrigerators, the televisions, in an entire city.
If an electromagnetic pulse went off over a city, basically all the electronic things in your home would wink and go out, and they would be permanently destroyed.
We're going to go back to the 1800s. With this kind of a society, we are not going to have refrigerators, dishwashers, and dare I say even a microwave. We're not going to have cell phones, telephones, and we're going to not have any form of communication as we know it. Without this communication, there's going to be complete chaos. There's going to be panic in the streets. Talk about issues of control and crowd control in particular. It's going to be complete chaos.
We know that weapons manufacturers will continue to perfect electromagnetic weapons, but we don't know what the effects will be, either for the environment or for the people. Incidents like Bell Island's massive explosion of energy remain unexplained. Many believe that it was the result of a failed military experiment. Why else did a Russian general and Los Alamos scientists rush to the scene? One popular theory was that Russia was attempting to beam an electromagnetic signal to Cuba, but the signal was pulled down because the island's iron ore deposits and miles of underground copper piping acted like a magnet. Others insist that the beam was caused by a massive solar flare, and there is also the theory of ball lightning. We may never know what really happened on Bell Island, whether the beam was a weapon or a natural phenomenon, but we do know that weapons which will copy the Bell Island blast are the future of warfare.
What if the colossal blast had landed not on tranquil Bell Island, but on bustling Toronto or New York? What damage would it have done in a densely populated electronic jungle?
The point is, when you start looking at affecting human beings, I think we need to be involved in that discussion. Human beings need to be having that debate. If we're going to develop new weapon systems that potentially are going to change the shape of war within the democracies, particularly those that are strong and controlling the military forces of the planet right now, we ought to have those discussions, and they're not taking place.
So you never know probably for years, what the long-term effects of the use of any weapon is going to be, and especially one like this that depends on sort of these intense bursts of radiation, electromagnetic radiation.